Morning. So yesterday, if you follow this channel, you will remember that I proposed a question to you, kind of at the end of our daily financial update, and that was kind of what the intellectual exercise of thinking about what would happen if rates were zero or slightly negative for a decade in the U.S. And while doing that, I kind of challenged myself to think about it. So I wanted to give you my thoughts. It's been about 24 hours. And clearly, I've been thinking about it for a while. Yes, I am a paper guy. I'm not a digital guy. So what I did is first thing I did is I kind of broke down, kind of the big headlines of what groups might be affected by a 0% interest rate for 10 years. So I'll go through that list with you just to see if I missed any, because it's certainly possible, and if I did, let me know. But those kind of, it always starts with kind of savers and debtors. Obviously, anytime you're thinking about interest rates, there is somebody borrowing and somebody lending, right? So what I did there is I called one section or one portion savers. I called another one investors. Then I went off to who are kind of users of debt. And in our economy, there's really two, right? There's consumers and frankly our government, and I cover the businesses in a separate section. So consumers and government, we kind of take a look at and see what's going on. Then we obviously have the banks, right? What happens to them? Because they, in the fractional lending environment, they pay one and lend out at six at a 10-to-1 ratio. So they're going to be impacted if you're collapsing their spread, right? Net interest carry or something they call that. Then I thought about what are the industries that are kind of built on debt, and I sort of came up with three big ones. And again, there's probably more, but I wanted to share them. So there's obviously builders, right? Home builders. Um, there's car manufacturers, right? And then there's, frankly, our education system, universities and colleges, right? All three of those allow you to take on debt and pay it off at some time in the future. And then I stepped back and said, okay, what would really start this zero interest rate? And we start with kind of the economy. So those were the 7 areas that I kind of first thought about, right? Who would be impacted, what would happen. I'll kind of try to walk through them and kind of how I peeled them together. But again, this is really my thoughts. I really want to hear what you think. I don't claim to have any crystal ball or know what this would look like. This is purely an intellectual exercise. There's no, at least I didn't find any history to go back and look on to see. So let's talk about it. So I'll start with the economy, right? What would push us to 0% interest rates or negative for a decade? Well, frankly, I think there's only one thing, and that's a recession, and then a continued lack of growth, right? It wouldn't even have to be it doesn't have to be a 10-year recession by any means, right? It could be flat to nominal growth, right? 0.2, something like that, right? If the US economy is growing at that kind of dismal rates, I think I think the Fed would be, keen on not having a lost decade. I think the Fed looks at Japan and looks at some other economies and goes, we don't want that. And they would do everything they could to spark the economy. So I think that's what leads us off. So we start a decade or a lost decade or 0% interest because of a slowing economy, right? And probably a recession kicks it off, but then we stay in it for a decade because lack of growth. So that's what I think sparks this. So what happens? First off, rates go to zero or whatever. Savers, right? The people, baby boomers and like anybody that relies on that kind of interest income, they're crushed, right? And if you were paying attention or looking at the news during the Great Recession, um, lots of people were hurt, right? Money market rates went to zero. Actually, some money market funds went out of business, and there's going to be some people that get hurt. And I think what savers do after the momentary kind of slap in the face is, I think, is the longer this goes on, right? If 1, 2, 3 years, maybe they don't change what they're doing. But I think what eventually happens to savers is, unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, but I think unfortunately, I think they look to take on more risk. I think they're going to look for other ways to generate a return. And I think, unfortunately, what happens to them is they look at unregulated markets. Maybe they become bait for charlatans and other people spinning a good story. And I think some of our savers, some of our elderly that depend on this, I think they get swindled. I think if we are in a decade-long 0% interest rate, we are going to have some people chase return, and they are going to become bait for unethical people, and they're going to lose their life savings. I certainly don't hope this happens. That would be horrible. But again, if you play the chessboard, you could see somebody who had a couple of $100,000 in the bank after 50 years of working. They used to get, I don't know, $1,000 a month in interest, and now they're getting 100. And pretty soon they're going to realize that couple of $100,000 is getting smaller and smaller, and they're going to go chase return. And they're going to have somebody sing a good song about a 8% return or a 10% return, and give me your money, trust me, trust me, trust me. Ponzi scheme blows up, boom, savers get crushed. So I don't have very many nice things. I don't see how savers win in this. I just don't. That's unfortunate. So investors, some people might call them debtors, people who rely on debt. First off, right, as this 10-year cycle starts, I think a lot of them, myself included, refi existing loans, right? Maybe we have existing mortgages at 5, 6, maybe even 7%. Maybe we have some at 4, I don't know. But if rates go to 2, 1.5, something like that, you better believe people are going to refi big time. That's going to lower their debt burden. It's going to increase cash flow. It's going to have the ability to have more debt service and the like. And I think investors go crazy. I think investors buy, right? Especially if they're getting fixed rate loans for 30 years. I think prices go up, and I think they suffer lower returns. And I think that's going to feel really good for a few years. The people that get in first will win. I believe investors will eventually have the herd mentality, and it will be like nothing we've seen before. I thought the herd mentality in 07 or 08 was crazy. I think this will be 5x that. I think people will be paying close to double what things are worth. And I think we will see the biggest bubble in assets we have ever seen. And I don't say bubble is a good thing. And again, this is probably at year 7, 8 of a 10-year cycle. I think asset prices are the most gigantic bubble ever created. And that's not a good thing. It feels good in the beginning, don't get me wrong, but that just scares me to think about what could happen. So that's investors. Consumers. I see consumers assuming, right, because we start this with a recession, assuming you're employed and you feel rather safe. I think consumers go crazy. I think the consumer economy picks up. I can see consumers being offered things they've never seen before, right? Hey, come get a new car once a year, 0%, hey, we'll pay you, blah, blah, blah. I mean, we could see new college tuition programs where, hey, fixed rate, fixed fee for the life of your education, doesn't how long it takes. I think there will be so many other creative offerings for consumers that they'll feel like this is almost free. Unfortunately, what they're doing is signing up for streams of debt. I'm a big person talking about needs and wants. They are going to be offered lots of ways to get more wants in a seemingly free way. It's never free, right? Or inexpensive, right? $10 a week for the rest of your life. You get an education from Harvard. I don't know. I'm just making this up. But stuff like that. And, I think the consumers start off in a good place. I think we get kind of used to it. And we don't see, I think people are going to see no downside in spending, right? What are they? So this is the choice, right? I can put it in the bank and get nothing, or I can enjoy it today. So I think the average consumer is just going to spend like crazy, and they're not going to see a downside. Nobody will be saving. Consumers will be spending and not savings, and after this decade is over, they're going to be in a horrible position, just horrible. Um, so I so far this is not a lot of fun, right? This last decade or 0% interest, savers are hurt. They're going to get suckered out of money. Investors are going to create a bubble, and consumers are going to get lazy. This is not feeling very good to me. Then we move on to the government. Who does anybody think the government doesn't do anything except spend like crazy? Really? I mean, come on. First off, let's be real. They are going to be able to refi existing debt, I guess you would call it. I don't know what their debt service is today. Is it 3, 4, 5%? It's going to be 1%. So first off, their debt's not going to get lower, right? They're not going to be paying down debt. That's not seemingly what politicians do. But their debt service is going to feel better. It's going to be easier to pay off. But that's just going to mean they're going to spend more. I think what's going to happen is they're going to put up just this monster spending bill. Probably on infrastructure is the only thing I can think of. It's going to be big, like $1 trillion big. I think the government's going to spend $1 trillion on good things because, again, they're trying to spark the economy, right? Remember how this all started, a slow growth economy? So they're going to employ a gazillion people. They're going to be building highways and bridges and dams and just high speed rail, and they're going to spend, spend, spend. But like the consumers and like the investors, where it feels good in the beginning, near the tail end of this 10-year cycle, they're going to look at their debt burden and go, we can't pay this off. If rates go from 1 to 2%, what happens? So I think what happens near the end of this is they realize they have no other choice. They have to raise taxes. We got to pay for it somehow. So I think taxes go up at the end of 10 years. Again, it'll feel good in the first 4, 5, 6 years, but taxes will go up. So again, probably not a great feeling. Leaves us two more things to talk about and then kind of the closing. So next up is banks, right? If you don't win by saving and there's an investing bubble, what do you suggest? All right, Nikki, I'll get to that at the end. I will make sure I close with that. What do I suggest? I'll get to that at the end. So banks, the industry of banks, right? If savers are on one side, banks are on the other. Banks are a for-profit organization. They need to make profit to keep the lights on, pay their employees, all of that. So if they're making smaller and smaller interest, you're going to see a rise in fees, ATM fees, overdraft fees, talking to a teller fees. They will do what they have to. They will also make more loans, right? They will create more loan programs. They will be a part of the early cycle where more lending happens. Because if they're making less per loan, they can make it up in volume. So I see that happening. And again, at the end, the banks will just find it harder to make money. So they will have to be creative. And again, that means hitting the average consumer with more fees and then finding ways to make more or different kind of loan packages. Pretty interesting. Then that leaves kind of the industries that I see that are addicted to debt. And I have three here. There's probably more. There's builders, like home builders. There's car manufacturers, and there's universities. So these industries are built on debt, and I see them heading into a 10-year cycle kind of limping. But I see what, again, being for-profit institutions, I think what they're going to do is they're going to change up what they offer, right? I could see, for example, a builder, instead of selling all their assets and into transitioning it, maybe they find a way to work with banks where they create packages where they can still be the owner of the asset. So, sort of like Zillow and Redfin and all these folks that are looking to create inventories of houses, what if a builder could find a way to keep all the houses they built as the owner and do some kind of lease to buyers? Kind of sell it like, hey, come live in our home, it's yours, blah, 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 but you're only here for 5 years or whatever. I could just see another way of offering stuff where the builders or the car manufacturers, right? Hey, come get a new car every year, kind of a version of a lease, if you will, where they maintain and keep the car longer term. Again, I think what happens in these cycles is people who own assets win, certainly in the beginning. But what will happen as we go forward is that, as we talked about with investors, there'll be a bubble. So back to the question that was really asked earlier and what I would like to talk about is do I think a lost decade is practical? I don't think so. I mean, think back to the Great Recession. The Great Recession, again, obviously I'm not old enough to have experienced the Depression. I've read about it a bunch. Um, but the Great Recession, by anybody's measures, didn't last more than 3 years. And that's because capitalism works. Some people call it the what is it, the animal, I forget what it's called, instincts or whatever it is. Basically, we get aggressive and we lean in and we capitalism works. And we are willing to kind of work through that. If the Great Recession, which was a debt bust, happens and we can get through that, I can't see the US having a lost decade. But back to the question at hand, right? If savers lose and kind of investors create a bubble, what do you do? So what I would do, right, if I really thought this was possible, is in the early parts of this cycle, I would refi all my debt. I would also take any assets I have that are free and clear, and I would put debt on them. So what have I just done? I've lowered my monthly expenses in all likelihood, but I've also probably increased my cash balances. I would then take that cash and go buy affordable assets. I'm talking about in years kind of 1 through 4 of this cycle. As I saw the bubble, growing, and if you don't follow me, I use the Affordability Index to track that. It's what saved us in '08, so I would still keep using that. At some point, this bubble would impact the affordability index of your market, and I would stop buying. I would just stop. And I would look like an idiot for probably 3 or 4 years because, hey, if it was 200 and then it's 210 and 220, hey, Michael, you're missing out, right? You're being an idiot. You're being stupid. I would be made fun of a lot. And I would just have to be okay with that because, the economy or the sillinesses of the market can go on a lot longer than I can remain liquid. So frankly, if this were to happen, is I would refi debt. I would go out and deploy that refi debt or capital into some new assets early in the cycle. And then I would keep up with my conservative nature and I would stop participating at year 4 or 5. And again, it would feel really, really bad for 4 or 5 years. During those 4 or 5 years, I would just be building my cash balance. And, at the end of that, I would be in a position to buy stuff on a discount, or I would look like an idiot. But that's okay because I would still have that other pile of stuff that I picked up early. So I would be okay. I wouldn't feel terrible. So that's what I would do. So you need to have, basically, the lesson here is if rates go to 0, take any debt you have that's higher than that and lower your monthly expenses. And then find some metric that works in your market or your industry that can tell you a bubble is growing. And at some point, you'll be uncomfortable with the bubble and then retract your participation and realize that the bubble's probably going to get bigger and just be comfortable with being early, right? It's better to leave a party early than stay too late and, get busted up by the cops or whatever. So hopefully that makes sense. I'd love to hear what you think. What would you do in a 10-year cycle? Any industries I missed? This was really just a mental or intellectual challenge. I'd love to hear from you. Leave comments below. Let me know what you think. Take care.